Hey, everybody, welcome to Odd and Untold, the podcast where we talk about all things strange and spooky. And this week, we're talking about some spooky cemeteries in New York City. And as is the idiom of the show, the untold part here, I'm going to be focusing on some lesser known cemeteries in the New York City area. A little bit of an emphasis on Staten Island, just because that's where I currently live, and that's where some of my more recent adventures have taken place. So if your favorite cemetery is not listed here from New York City, uh, that's purposeful. Because again, on this show, I really try to focus on some of the lesser known, untold stories. So that's what we're going to be focusing on this week. So I want to begin with Moravian Cemetery, and there's a reason for that. One, it is like the oldest operating cemetery on Staten Island currently. I believe it was built in 1740 or started operation in 1740. And and I'm starting with this one because this past weekend, lovely Rebecca and myself, my girlfriend Rebecca, we went hiking in High Rock Park, which abuts Moravian Cemetery. And there's another part of Moravian Cemetery that is private land. It's not public. And that is dedicated to the Vanderbilt family. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But first, I just want to talk to you little guys a little bit about Moravian Cemetery. So I will be sharing all these links where I read all my information from in the description below, so you guys can do some more research because I'm going to be pulling bits and pieces from each of these articles and sources here. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but I'm just going to pull out certain aspects that I want to talk about. So Moravian Cemetery, it's in the New Dorp neighborhood of Staten Island. Uh, it is the largest and oldest active cemetery on Staten Island, having opened in 1740. The cemetery encompasses 113 acres and is the property of the local Moravian Church congregation of Staten Island. To the cemetery southwest is High Rock Park, and that's I was telling you guys about. We hiked there the other day. It was a beautiful day on Sunday, so we took a nice long hike in the woods and Camp Pouch. There's a Boy Scout camp that kind of abuts High Rock Park. So all these things are in the same area. You can see in this map down here uh, that they're all, this greenish area here. It's all parks and cemeteries and uh, great park. I love High Rock Park. So the history, I'll read a little bit of this. In what was purely farming community, the 113-acre cemetery was originally made available as a free cemetery for the public in order to discourage families from using farm burial plots. Back then, you couldn't afford to bury your loved ones, so you'd bury them out behind the house. It's just the way of life back then. After the closure in the 1880s of the South Reformed Dutch Church in Richmond Town, which I've mentioned before, Richmond Town, the graves of that church's graveyard were reinterred at Moravian. A monument to Robert Gould Shaw, a Union soldier who led the first all-black regiment in the American Civil War and died in the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, was erected here by his family. So Robert Gould Shaw, if you ever seen the movie Glory with Matthew Broderick and Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington, it's a fantastic film about Robert Gould Shaw and his regiment and the Second Battle of Fort Wagner. So it's just a terrific movie. The Moravian Cemetery is the burial place for a number of famous Staten Islanders, including members of the Vanderbilt family, and the director Martin Scorsese also has a burial plot here, and we'll get to that. So I will come back to this part, the Vanderbilt part, because that is a separate part that we're going to talk about. But I want to talk about some of the other more notable burials that have taken place in the Moravian Cemetery. So I'm not going to go through all of these because there's a lot here. Um, Alice Austin, she was a photographer in the 20th century, so the early 1900s. She was a photographer, and her house is now Clear Comfort. It is a museum, and it is on the eastern end of Highland Boulevard here on Staten Island. And it's funny because on the western side, down in Tottenville, is the Conference House, which I've also spoken about on this show. So Highland Boulevard is kind of cool because it's kind of bookended by these two historic homes, the Alice Austin House and the Conference House, and both are allegedly haunted. And like I said, I've spoken about the Conference House before. Haven't really talked about Clear Comfort, the Alice Austin House, before on the podcast, but I will get to that at some point. But again, stories there just talk about footsteps and doors closing and sounds and muffled voices. And so some pretty cool ghost stories about that. But I just love that Highland Boulevard is sort of bookended by these two historic yet allegedly haunted homes. There are some mob bosses here. Frank Cali, former reputed boss of the Gambino crime family. Paul Castellano, former boss of the Gambino crime family. John Eberhard Faber, German born American manufacturer of pencils. So if you have a number two pencil and it says Faber on it, that's who that is. Charles Scorsese and Catherine Scorsese, so the father and mother of director Martin Scorsese, are buried here in Moravian Cemetery. And as I mentioned earlier, Martin Scorsese also has a burial plot here. So the Scorseses are there. Paul Zindel, notable playwright and young adult novelist, he wrote The Pigman, which I had mentioned in a couple episodes ago, Cryptids of Vermont. So, Pigman novelist is buried there. So, pretty cool to have some notable people buried here on Staten Island. And we'll get to some others who are buried on Staten Island as well. But these are all in Moravian Cemetery. So, pretty cool. So, as part of the Moravian Cemetery is the Vanderbilt Family Cemetery and Mausoleum. And if you look at the map here, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the map here. It's the same map as the Moravian Cemetery, but there's a different red square here, and that is showing the private land for the Vanderbilt Cemetery and Mausoleum. So I'll talk a little bit about this. And the Vanderbilt family is a very rich, famous family here in the United States. And Anderson Cooper, if you know Anderson Cooper, his mother was a Vanderbilt, Gloria Vanderbilt, and Anderson Cooper's brother is actually buried in this cemetery. So I'll talk about this. So it is a private burial site within the Moravian Cemetery in the New Dorp neighborhood of Staten Island in New York City. It was designed by Richard Morris Hunt and Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted designed so many things here in New York City in the late 19th century when the Vanderbilt family was the wealthiest in America. So there's within the cemetery, there are gravestones, there are big sort of not necessarily tombstones, but plaques on the ground and just burial sites so that you know who, certain family members were buried there. So, but the mausoleum of the Vanderbilt family is really the sight to see inside the Vanderbilt cemetery. So the mausoleum is on the eastern slope of Toad Hill inside the Moravian Cemetery. The cemetery opened in 1740. Toad Hill, ironically, is the highest natural point on the eastern seaboard between Cape Cod and Florida. So at 410 feet. Beautiful view from up there. We've climbed it a few times and been up there. So it's very cool. So the history here in 1865, Cornelius Vanderbilt gave the Moravian Church 8.5 acres. 3 years later, he donated an additional 45 acres, which is the majority of the Moravian Cemetery and the site of the private Vanderbilt lot. Later, his son William Henry Vanderbilt gave a further 4 acres and constructed the residence for the cemetery superintendent. William commissioned the family mausoleum and was the richest person in America when he died in December 1885. So let us talk about the mausoleum, and we'll get to some notable burials, but the mausoleum is really the unique feature here. The Vanderbilt Mausoleum, designed by Richard Morris Hunt and constructed in 1885 to 86, is part of the family's private section within the cemetery. Hunt's design was inspired by the 12th century Romanesque, and I'm going to butcher this, Saint Guy du Gard Abbey near Arles, France. The landscaped grounds around the mausoleum were designed by Olmsted. The Vanderbilt section is not open to the public. Interment within the mausoleum was reserved for those with the Vanderbilt name, including sons, their wives, and unmarried daughters. It houses the remains of all 4 of William and Maria's sons and 3 of their wives. The mausoleum was made a New York City designated landmark in 2016. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission's chair said at the time, the Vanderbilt Museum is an extraordinary monument to America's Gilded Age. In June 2021, the mausoleum was nominated for inclusion on the New York State and National Register of Historic Places. So, notable burials, again, Cornelius, William, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, who, son of Gloria Vanderbilt and Wyatt Cooper, older brother of Anderson Cooper from CNN. Gloria Vanderbilt is buried in there. So the mausoleum and I'm going to throw up some pictures here of the mausoleum. It is a huge structure. It is built into a hillside. It's beautiful. I know people who've gone in there. Again, it's private property. Uh, High Rock Park. If you go into High Rock Park, some of the trails run along the fence that separates High Rock Park and the Vanderbilt Cemetery, and there's no trespassing signs. You're not supposed to go in. There's really no way in. Sometimes you'll find a little hole that kids have sort of punched through the fence, and I have friends and acquaintances who've gone in there over the years. I'm not going to name names, who've gone in and checked out the mausoleum, taken pictures. Uh, Very, very beautiful structure, but there are some ghost stories surrounding it, and the main ones really center around photography. And a lot of people say if they take a picture and like say they're in there and one of their friends wants to pose, they'll take a picture of their friend, and in some instances, people report different things, but sometimes the person who's supposed to be in the picture is now not in the picture. So the mausoleum will be there and the person is now not in the photo. Alternately, some people take a picture and instead of one person being there, their friend, now there's like two people standing there. So a lot of the ghost stories surrounding the mausoleum concern photography. And there were legends that Cornelius was into the occult and mediums and felt that photography was a very spiritual thing. Back then with cameras, when photography was really first coming out, there was the whole, it'll steal your soul and all sorts of that stuff. So legends kind of grew that maybe it's Cornelius affecting the cameras. I did find a few ghost stories about the Vanderbilt tomb here on Weird NY, and I will read a few of these because they're kind of cool. So Echo Base 1005 writes, legend has it that if you take a picture of the Vanderbilt tomb, either the person in the picture will not be in it when you develop it, or there will be another person in the picture that was not there originally. I plan on getting some more pictures sometime in the future. It's kind of risky since it's on private property inside the cemetery. The day I took this one, there was only one picture left on the roll of film. If I get any better ones, I'll send them to you, especially if anything weird happens. So this looks like, I'll see if I can blow this up as well, but this is a picture of the tomb, and I don't see anything weird here. It's not that it's going to happen every single time, but here's somebody sort of talking about the legend that either the person disappears or an additional person is supposed to be there. And I'll get into talking about what I think about that in a second, but I just want to read these other ghost stories here. So this one is from someone named Joe Bruschetta. When I was a teenager, we heard about the Vanderbilt's tomb in Staten Island. We tried several times to find it, each time being scared out of our wits. The story is that they were not buried, but propped up like statues in a tomb that resembled a large mansion. It's supposed to be in a cemetery in Staten Island off Toad Hill Road. We went there 3 nights in a row after midnight. Each night we hopped the fence and started to travel into the graveyard. The first night, as we started in, we passed a hillside with all these small tombstones. We stopped and looked at them. They were all only a couple of years old. We had started to walk away when we heard a baby's cry. We looked at each other and asked, "Did you hear that?" We panicked and ran out, scared stiff. The next night, we went a little further until a glowing light appeared, resembling a girl with long hair. We ran so fast that we jumped over the top of the fence in one leap. On the third night, we approached a wrought iron fence with what appeared to be a large mausoleum set in a hillside with a rotunda on top. That would be the Vanderbilt mausoleum. There's another mausoleum in there that's a little bit smaller, the Sloan mausoleum. We turned around, and there was a man in a suit standing next to us. We looked at each other, and he vanished instantly. We then ran the hell out of there. Was it a case of mass hysteria, or was it real? We will never know. We never went back. So here's people saying they saw an apparition of a man. They saw a glowing light. They've heard like what sounded like a baby cry. And again, this area is there are houses nearby, but it's a wooded area. It's right off High Rock Park. And here's a picture of the front gate, and there's a story about that too, which I'll get into. But here's the last sort of spooky story I could find from, oh God, the username is Wreck Some Ass. Very classy. Keep it classy, Staten Island. Uh, Vanderbilt's is pretty sick. The tomb itself is at least 3 stories high. It's part of the Moravian cemetery, but it's separate from the whole cemetery. There's a locked gate at the entrance to the cemetery, but the area also borders High Rock Park, so it's easier to get in from the woods. The tomb is actually built into the side of a hill, so you can walk up the back path onto the top of it. I didn't know that. I thought you had to get in through the fence. There's also another smaller mausoleum called the Sloan Tomb, which I just mentioned. The family buried there built some of the houses on Sloan Avenue, which is a block bordering on the main entrance of High Rock Park. It used to be a hangout for the groups of people who knew about it, but security has gotten tight there at night. Recently, they put a motion detector there, which has a recording over a loudspeaker telling you you're trespassing. Every 4 years or so, the tomb is opened for the family to go inside. I don't know how many people are buried there. Overall, it is a really freaky place to be at night. There are plenty of unexplained noises. It's definitely worth seeing in person. Uh, so, and the story about this gate, I guess there was a visitor there one time, and she was trying to pull the iron gate closed, and it sort of fell off its hinges, or the hinges broke, and the gate fell on her, and she died. So, of course, that's going to spark some local legends as well, and ghost stories. But these are really the only stories I could find. These sort of vague allusions to people taking photographs, and either an apparition being there or the person they photographed not being there for some reason. And for me, photography is a weird thing, because if you're trespassing and you're going in there and you know your mind is focused on other things, and you take pictures, and then especially because some of these seem to be like, once the photo is developed, they're talking about older cameras. They're not talking about cell phone cameras or digital cameras where you get the image immediately. So they're sending their photos off to be developed, and then they're getting them back. Oh my God, I took a picture of Sally and she's not there. Did you? Or did you just think you took a picture of her? Maybe it didn't register on the camera, or maybe just 2, 3 weeks went by and you can't remember if she was actually in the photo or not. So that could be explained, I suppose. A little tougher to explain is an additional person being there. And again, one of these stories talks about a little girl, or a man in a suit. Not that they photograph them, but seeing them there. And if you do photograph and there's an extra person there, that's a little tougher to explain, because if 3 people break into the cemetery and take a photo, and one person's taking the photo of the other two, and there's 3 people on that photo, where did that third person come from? So that's a little more interesting to me. But again, I haven't found any photos. So this is all just anecdotal evidence. This is all just stories at this point, and rumor. Interesting stories. And I think most cemeteries, people just attach ghost stories to them, and feel like they're haunted. And I've never really felt that way. We've investigated some public cemeteries and never really found anything of note. I mean, they're usually very peaceful. Uh, I don't know what this cry in the woods they would have heard. Um, I know there's plenty of deer on Staten Island. There is wildlife. We do have coyote and fox, and the foxes can, when they cry, they can sound like women screaming or babies crying sometimes. So it's very possible they heard that, or just sometimes, people go into the woods at night and looking to scare themselves, and that's exactly what they do. So very possible that that's what happened here. Um, but it's a beautiful building, a beautiful uh, part of Staten Island. I love High Rock Park. It's just the trails in there are really nice. And we had a great time the other day, just lots of little streams. And like I said, the Boy Scout camp is in there. So we found some lean-tos, and we just had a really good time exploring. It's very hilly, lots of, like I said, streams and rocks. And it's just nice to be in New York City and be able to escape the city part of it, and just get into nature and see wildlife and trees and fresh air. And I wish we, could have gone into the cemetery, but it is private property, and trespassing is a no-no. So you don't want to do that. And I'm coming up on 50. I can't be trespassing anymore. 20 years ago, perhaps. Um, but I am just way too old to be trespassing and getting caught. And uh, but hopefully one day when it's open, I will get inside there. And we just loved our walk the other day, and it just, after this, Rebecca was just sort of saying, "Why don't you do a show on this type of stuff, cemeteries. And she made some other suggestions, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But I do a lot of Bigfoot stuff, and that's not everybody's cup of tea. So here I am doing some cemetery stuff. So we're going to move on. And this next one was one that Rebecca told me about. I'd never heard of that about this one before, and you guys probably haven't either. So this one is a creepy one. Okay, so the next cemetery slash burial ground in New York City that we're going to talk about is called Hart Island. And I had never heard of this place. Um, and Rebecca was telling me about this on one of our walks a couple of weeks ago. And then the other day we were talking about this episode and stuff we could talk about. And she brought this one up again and sent me some links. So I'm going to read to you guys a little bit about Hart Island. So this is from a website called Culture Trip. New York is one of the most famous cities in the world, but even the Big Apple harbors its secrets. One such secret can be found floating in the Long Island Sound, where an island so steeped in mystery it doesn't appear on MTA maps, houses more than 1 million former New York residents, but none of them alive today. Discover the sometimes spooky, always fascinating tale behind New York City's never-mentioned feature, Hart Island. Even prior to when it was first purchased by New York City back in 1868, Hart Island was the site of many misfortunes. During its time as a Civil War prison camp, 235 prisoners are reported to have died and been buried on the island, the first event in what would be a chain of tragedies to unfold on the island. In 1870, shortly after acquiring the island, the city's most recent purchase played host to a quarantine facility for yellow fever victims. After the epidemic, along with many of the hospital's patients, had passed, Hart Island went on to house a women's insane asylum, a tuberculosis hospital, a Cold War Nike missile base, and a prison. In each of the island's reincarnations, only death and mystery served as constant presences. So this is an island in Long Island Sound, so kind of off the coast of the Bronx and north of Brooklyn and Queens, and just kind of in that area, like near Rikers Island, New York City, kind of off Manhattan, above Long Island, and south of Connecticut. That's Long Island Sound, and lots of little islands in there. So Rikers Island, Hart Island is in there. Um, so we're going to get into a little bit more of Hart's Island here, or Hart Island. It's been called both alternately, Hart Island or Hart's Island. With a history like this, Hart Island's current incarnation as the United States' largest tax-funded cemetery should come as no surprise. With roughly 1,500 burials taking place each year, the island houses over 1 million bodies, all of which are either unknown or unclaimed. Everyone from destitute individuals to people without relatives or personal records identifying their burial requests can be found buried on the Potter's Field, or burial grounds for unidentified bodies. Since the 1800s, inmates from New York's Rikers Island have been charged with conducting the burial process, from transporting the deceased via ferry to digging the graves to burying the bodies in stacks of 3 feet below the ground. The surprising cast of caretakers is one of the many chilling facts about the island contributing to the rumors which surround it. While there have been no recorded reports of spectral sightings, it's easy to understand why many consider Hart Island to be haunted, off limits to the public, enforcing strict regulations for its scarce gravesite visiting hours, and housing no permanent living residents. Hart Island is dominated by the dead. Moreover, about 300 to 600 of the bodies buried each year are first used as medical cadavers, a practice which can be viewed as disturbing the deceased. Adding to the island's abandoned atmosphere are structures forgotten by the living decades ago, including a chapel and hospital buildings. As sad as it is spooky, the tale of Hart Island is the best ghost story you've never heard of, and one New York attraction you may want to leave off your list. So again, this is another one that I've not been able to find any specific ghost stories for, but I think that is really just because, yeah, it's not a place where people can just go. Um, I believe they have opened it as a park now, so you can take a ferry there. It is open to the public. Limited access. I think you have to make reservations and, to take the ferry, and I think it's only on Tuesdays. So it is open to the public now, but in a very limited capacity. But it used to not be. So Hart Island, as they said, it's a potter's field. So bodies that are unclaimed, homeless people, bodies that are found that there's no bodies that are found that there's no identifying uh, ID with them, or no one in the family can ID them, just unknown people. as well as amputated body parts. So it's one of those things where when someone's in the hospital and they lose a leg or they lose an arm, where do those pieces go? They don't get just thrown out. They get buried on Hart Island uh, because they can't just throw out an arm or a leg. There's no real way for them to get rid of them. So they get buried on Hart Island. And uh, very interesting. They have the inmates from Rikers build the graves. And when Rebecca and I were researching this, they were saying that they don't bury the bodies very deep, and they bury them very close to one another. I mean, I guess land is at a premium there. It's an island. It's a finite space, but they don't bury the bodies very deep because if they need to retrieve a body, if they bury somebody and then 2 years later someone comes forward and says, "Hey, my sister died, or my brother died, or my son died, and I want DNA testing, or I want to see if I can identify the body," it makes it easier for them uh, to retrieve the body and do the testing. So, very spooky. So I'll read this to you. This is just detailing the burials. So as I mentioned, the dead are buried in trenches. Babies are placed in coffins, which are stacked in groups of 100, measuring 5 coffins deep and usually in 20 rows. Adults are placed in larger pine boxes, placed according to size, and are stacked in sections of 150, measuring 3 coffins deep in 2 rows and laid out in a grid system. There are 7 sizes of coffins, which range from 1 to 7 feet. Each box is labeled with an ID number, the person's age, ethnicity, and the place where the body was found, if applicable. Prior to civilian contractors doing the actual burials, which began in 2020, inmates from the nearby Rikers Island jail were paid 50 cents an hour to bury bodies on Hart Island. The bodies of adults are frequently disinterred when families are able to locate their relatives through DNA, photographs, and fingerprints kept on file at the Office of Chief Medical Examiner of the City of New York. There were an average of 72 disinterments per year from 2007 to 2009. As a result, the adult coffins are staggered to expedite removal. Children, mostly infants, are rarely disinterred. So I guess with infants and children, it's just poor people, um, people who don't understand that their child will be buried here, uh, maybe abandoned babies, but usually I'm guessing it's because the infants are identified, and it's the adults who often go unidentified or unclaimed. It could be somebody who just has no family or somebody who doesn't know that they passed on. So very sad. Hart Island has also been used for burials of disease victims during epidemics and pandemics. During the 1980s AIDS epidemic, those who had died from AIDS were the only people to be buried in separate graves. At first, bodies were delivered in body bags and buried by inmate workers wearing protective jumpsuits. When it was later discovered that the corpses could not spread HIV, the city started burying people who had died of AIDS in the mass graves. In 2008, the island was selected as a site for mass burials during a particularly extreme flu pandemic, available for up to 20,000 bodies. During the COVID-19 pandemic in New York City, Hart Island was designated as the temporary burial site for people who had died from COVID-19 if deaths overwhelmed the capacity of mortuaries. At the time, deaths at home within the city had increased significantly, though the corpses were not tested for COVID-19. Preparations for mass graves began at the end of March 2020, and private contractors were hired to replace inmate labor for mass grave burials. So, although several media sources reported in April of 2020 that burials had begun, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, boo, we don't like him here, clarified that Hart Island was only being used to bury unclaimed corpses, as well as the bodies of those who chose it as a burial place. Um, so, yeah, just very sad sort of place. There's a one notable person who was buried here. Academy Award winner Bobby Driscoll, who was found dead in 1968 in an East Village tenement, was buried on Hart Island because his remains could not be identified in a timely fashion. So I guess they identified him later. And then someone else, the composer Noah Krashevsky, was interred on Hart Island at his own request because, according to his husband David Sachs, Krashevsky wanted to protest the trappings and cost of traditional funerals. So very interesting. And here's just an aerial view of the island. So yeah, a very sad story. Just um, a very different type of cemetery. It's not a place where most people choose to be buried, though some do. But it does seem to have been over most of the years to be used for diseases and pandemics and uh, people who have not been identified, people whose remains have not been claimed by the family. Again, a lot of people can't afford a large funeral. I mean, funerals are very expensive, just from the coffin to the gravestone. I mean, you're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And if a family can't afford that, you let the city bury them, and they will bury them here. And they do allow the family to go see. And they have opened this as a park. Again, very limited access, but it is open to the public now. So you can look into this and visit Hart Island if you want to. So very interesting. And again, I can't find any ghost stories, and I'm guessing a lot of that has to do with just there's not a lot of the public being allowed there. So there's not a lot of people there. Anybody who is there is a worker, is a prison inmate, is a independent contractor or a private contractor who civilian contractors who are burying the bodies, but nobody's there sort of full time to put stories out there. And the few people who are probably don't want to talk about any weird experiences they have because their job would depend on it. You know, they're probably security or they're part of the parks department. Um, they run the cemetery. They don't want to be saying, yeah, there was a ghost. So very hard to find ghost stories, but you got to figure if any cemetery is going to be possibly haunted, it might be a cemetery like this. So Hart Island, very cool. Thank you, Rebecca. That was a very good suggestion. Okay, so the next location I want to talk about is not really a formal cemetery, but people have died here and people have been buried here. It is called Execution Rocks Light. It is a lighthouse in the middle of Long Island Sound on the border between New Rochelle and Sands Point, New York. 55 feet tall with a white light flashing every 10 seconds. The granite tower is painted white with a brown band around the middle. It has an attached stonekeeper's house, which has not been inhabited since the light was automated in 1979. So a lot of these lighthouses are just automated now. You don't need a lighthouse keeper to live there and change the bulbs and make sure the light goes on every night. But this is also just in Long Island Sound, very close to New York City. But there's a reason it's called Execution Rocks. So there's varying stories here. So I'm just going to read a little bit about the history and then we can kind of talk about the various stories. The island on which this lighthouse sits is claimed to derive its name from colonial New York, when slave-owning settlers of Sands Point murdered enslaved people by chaining them to the rocks during low tide to let them drown. This tale is first recorded by Robert Caro in 1974. A 1964 account in the Journal of Long Island History claims that, in fact, murderers were manacled with chains to staples driven into the rock at low tide. A more likely etymology is that the British Admiralty named them Executioner's Rocks because so many ships ran aground on the treacherous rocks. References to the Execution Rocks in the Long Island Sound predate the American Revolution, existing as far back as 1766. So, as with many sort of spooky stories or ghost stories, you have these different origin stories for how it came to be. There's also another story that it was the British troops who chained revolutionary soldiers, American soldiers, rebels, that they had captured during the war to these rocks and let them drown. So, was it murderers? Was it enslaved people being punished? Was it American colonial soldiers who were uprising against the British? That, who knows? I mean, it could have been any one of those. It could have been all three. So who knows? But I do think uh, the one that's probably easily provable is the execution rocks that predate the American Revolution, that ships would just run aground here. And that's why there's a lighthouse there now. Uh, so there was another little tidbit. Um, and I'm going to switch here because allegedly a serial killer named Carl Panzram claimed in a posthumous autobiography that in the summer of 1920 he raped and killed a total of 10 sailors and dumped their bodies at sea near Execution Rocks Light. And I will read to you a little bit about that. A serial killer's dumping ground. This is from Travel Channel. In August 1920, Carl Panzram was a thief in need of a house to rob. At 113 Whitney Avenue in New Haven, Connecticut, he plundered the rooms, making off with pricey goods and some valuable bonds. It wasn't until after he left the residence and was en route to Manhattan that he noticed the name of the stolen bonds: William H. Taft, former president of the United States and now a professor at Yale University. He sold them for top dollar and continued his spree. In New York, Panzram robbed yachts and boats all over the Long Island Sound before settling his sights on much darker crimes. He began killing in cold blood, with the .44 Colt automatic stolen from William Taft's home. Panzram's pattern of killing involved tying rocks to each body, rowing them out into the Long Island Sound, and dumping them just 100 yards from the Execution Rock Lighthouse. In his autobiography, Killer, A Journal of a Murder, Panzram writes, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons. For all these things, I am not in the least bit sorry." Many of Panzram's victims were mercilessly tossed into the waters near Execution Rock Lighthouse. So yeah, there's this weird history of that as well. And again, hard to find ghost stories. Really, all I could find, some visitors to the lighthouse have claimed to have heard footsteps and unusual sounds and sighted apparitions. So nothing specific, but I've heard a lot of these uh, types of stories. Since 1979, the Execution Rocks Lighthouse living quarters have been unoccupied. However, some visitors to the lighthouse have claimed to have heard footsteps and unusual sounds and sighted apparitions, which I just said. Um, so, and there are the stories about people on boats, and as they're approaching the island, there's weird sounds, howling sounds, and screaming sounds. And to me, I sort of attribute that to just being on the water, Long Island Sound. The wind can whip through. You're on the water. Sound just carries differently out there. And if you're on a boat, anyone who's ever been on a boat or near water, you can clearly tell that sound travels. People talking on shore, you can hear them, or if you're on shore, people are on a boat, they could be hundreds and hundreds of yards away and they could just be having a conversation. You can hear them pretty clearly. So don't know if that means anything. Um, but the island, this little lighthouse has a weird history and hard to say. I mean, was it just sailors dying in shipwrecks? Was it the British chaining prisoners of war there to die? Was it slave owners chaining their slaves there to die? Was it just an execution place for murderers that the locals would chain anybody in the community who was a murderer to these rocks and let the tide just sort of come up and drown them until they died? And I've heard whispers that when the tide is really low, you can still see the chains out there. And I don't know if that's true. Might be worth a trip one time, Rebecca, if you want to come with me. Um, but I definitely think, very, very cool history. And it's just one of those places in New York City that I had never heard of. Again, another one of these places, just like Hart Island, I had never heard of until Rebecca brought this up to me. Uh, and again, the haunted ghost story aspect of it is a little bit on the vague side, but the history behind it is very cool. And you can understand why this place might be haunted. So, very cool. Okay, so the next story I want to talk about is that of Ichabod Crane. And most people have heard of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, Ichabod Crane. Few people know that he was an actual person, and he is buried on Staten Island. So, Ichabod Bennett Crane, born July 18th, 1787, died October 5th, 1857, was an American career military officer for 48 years and the probable namesake of the protagonist in Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now, there's no direct proof that Washington Irving uh, based Ichabod Crane, the character, on Ichabod Crane, the colonel. They are known to have met each other once. And what are the chances that Washington Irving would just come up with his name out of thin air, Ichabod Crane, and there's a guy named Ichabod Crane who he met? So we can't really say he definitely is the namesake of the character of Ichabod Crane, but come on. um, so for the real Ichabod Crane, he was born in Elizabethtown, now Elizabeth, New Jersey. So very close to Staten Island. It's basically just over the bridge. He was a son of General William Crane. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1809 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant assigned to the USS United States, a 44-gun frigate commanded by Stephen Decatur. He served aboard the United States for 2 years. He resigned from the Marines in April 1812 to accept a commission in the United States Army as a captain in command of Company B, 3rd Artillery. The unit designation would later be Battery B, 1st Artillery. So he had a very sort of, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, but he had a very celebrated military career. And he came back to Staten Island. So Crane and his wife Charlotte had a house built in the New Springville section of Staten Island, New York, in 1853 while he was still on active duty. The house was located at 3525 Victory Boulevard. It was demolished in the 1990s. Very sad. I hate when they do that. And there are some really cool historic places here on Staten Island, Richmond Town, the Conference House, Alice Austin House. But that's sad to me that Ichabod Crane's house was demolished in the 90s. The owner had offered it to historic Richmond Town. So Richmond Town, again, is this like little colonial village, and there's lots of like old buildings there, most of which were taken from other places on Staten Island and sort of assembled into this little historic village to replicate, a town from the 1700s. Um, so the owner had offered it to Richmond Town on the condition they move it off its former site. It never transpired due to a lack of funding. So yeah, as what happens with a lot of historic things, the funding is tough to find. The government can find funding for all sorts of things, not to get political here, but wars and foreign aid and all sorts of silly things and $2,000 toilet seats, but houses like this are demolished. So very sad to me, and I'm a little salty about that. Crane died in October 1857 while still on active duty and is buried in Asbury Methodist Cemetery in New Springville, Staten Island, not far from his former home. His grave marker bears the inscription, "He served his country faithfully 48 years and was much beloved and respected by all who knew him." So this is another place that a few months back, Rebecca and I had uh, found his grave. We had gone to the Asbury Cemetery and found his grave marker. And I'll throw some pictures up here of his grave marker that I took that day, because this is a public cemetery. You can just go in and find it. It's right on Richmond Road, right very close to Victory Boulevard. But it's just on the side of the road. You could just park down on a side street and walk into the cemetery. And a lot of old gravestones in there. It's a beautiful old cemetery. Nice, old church right there. But his grave marker is there, and it's very cool just to see this person that almost everybody knows. I mean, even if you know the exact story of Sleepy Hollow, everybody knows the Headless Horseman. They know Ichabod Crane, uh, either from the Disney cartoon or the Johnny Depp movie. There's just so many iterations of it. How could you not know the legend of Sleepy Hollow and Ichabod Crane? But here lies the actual Ichabod Crane. And while there's no ghost stories associated with his burial or his tombstone, and but just the fact that one of Americana's best known and best loved ghost stories, the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, uh, that there's that connection to that here on Staten Island, just was very cool to me. So not a specific ghost story, but again, one of America's earliest ghost stories, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So very cool that he's buried out here. And just to add a little bit of creepiness to this, I'm going to talk about a little. He had some family here, and just one little thing stood out to me. His daughter, Eliza Crane, disappeared on July 20th, 1858, after taking a ferry from Staten Island to Manhattan. Her husband, Captain and future Brevet Major General John M. Brannan, was in command of the Department of Key West in Florida, assigned to Fort Zachary Taylor. She had been living at the fort with her husband, but went to Staten Island to stay with her mother due to illness. So just a weird story that she got on the ferry, went to Manhattan, and disappeared. So again, not a ghost story, but a little bit of a mystery. Like, where did she go? I don't believe this mystery was ever solved. And did she run away? Was she murdered? Was she kidnapped? Who knows? So just cool little tidbit. Not cool. I mean, she disappeared, but a spooky little tidbit here. And then, of course, the legacy of Sleepy Hollow. The main character of Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is named Ichabod Crane. While Washington Irving did not expressly admit that the character is named after Colonel Crane, the two men had met in 1814 at Fort Pike, located on Lake Ontario in Sackett's Harbor, New York. Irving was an aide de camp to New York Governor Daniel D. Tompkins, who was inspecting defenses in the Sackett's Harbor area. Crane's somewhat unusual and memorable first name, Ichabod, comes from the biblical figure of that name, the son of Phinehas and grandson of Eli, the high priest. So again, like what are the chances that Irving just picked this name out of thin air? He didn't. He clearly had to have based it on Ichabod Crane, Colonel Crane, which is very cool legacy. But he did serve his country very well, and for many, 48 years he served in the military. So dedicated to his country. Sadly, again, his daughter Eliza disappeared. Um, so very strange. So let us move on to the last cemetery. Okay, so the last cemetery I want to talk about is very little known. Rebecca and I stumbled upon this by accident one day. We were hiking, I believe it was on Martin Luther King Day. We both had the day off from work. It was a very chilly day, but we were like, let's go for a hike. And we went for a hike. And we're just hiking along Richmond Creek. Uh, and, on our way to St. Andrew's Church, which also has a cemetery. And we checked out that cemetery as well. But on our way back, so we hiked, along Richmond Creek, along the Blue Trail, and then we came back. And on the way back, I'm looking on my phone just to kind of check the trails because we wanted to kind of go a different way than we had come in. And I saw that a little cemetery was marked on the map, and it is the Bedell Decker Family Cemetery. And it's in the woods. So we were like, all right, we have to kind of find this. It's on Google Maps. So let's go find it. Uh, and I'll just read to you a little bit here. The cemetery is on a hill near Richmond Creek, now within Latourette Park, Richmond Town, Staten Island. So, like I said, it's Richmond Town, Latourette Park. St. Andrews is right there. Richmond, St. Andrews is kind of part of Richmond Town. It consists of a small clearing near the cart path south of the intersection of Richmond Hill Road and Forest Hill Road. In 1901, there were 23 gravestones still standing. No standing gravestones remain. So this one was kind of heartbreaking for us. And I will tell that story. So Rebecca and I were hiking, and like I said, we found this little marker on Google Maps, and it was a little cemetery, family cemetery, Bedell Decker. So we said, let's go find it. So we hiked, and it wasn't a very far hike, and up a hill and through some bushes, and we come upon where the cemetery is marked, and it's part of a golf course now, and it's basically a golf cart turnaround. It's not even, I mean, it's part of the golf course, but it's not even like nice green hills or, grass. It's just a golf cart turnaround. It looked like there used to be like a ball washing or collecting station right there. Very sad. It's just this flat piece of land. It is up on a hill, but there are no more gravestones there. It's also called Ketchum's Hill. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from this. This is from the Staten Island Advance, Clay Wolney. 2 centuries ago, Ketchum's Mill was an active part of the Ketchum property. Today, only the stonework of the mill still stands in the woods along Forest Hill Road. And Rebecca and I had come across some ruins. I don't know if they're part of the mill. We do want to go back. Again, when we found the cemetery, it was late in the day. It was very cold, and we were losing daylight, so we kind of had to go. Uh, while many of the older roadways around Staten Island have grown and developed over the past century, Old Mill Road seems to have been left behind. Beginning alongside the Church of St. Andrew in Richmond, Old Mill Road runs along the hillside below Latourette Golf Course. Richmond Creek, which lies on the south side of the road, was an important influence on the area and may be the reason the road was made in the first place. Today, the trail along the old roadway is nicely maintained by the Parks Department. Prior to the parks development of the trail 5 years ago, the dirt road had fallen under the influence of natural succession. Potholes had become ponds, grasses and wildflowers, and even tree saplings covered the drier areas of the road, making it almost impassable. The new pathway has opened the area to hikers, naturalists, and casual strollers as never before. So, yeah, we were hiking there. The Hessian Spring is another notable natural feature along the road. This natural spring begins at the top of the hill, not far above the Blue Trail. As one of the few freshwater springs still active on Staten Island, the Hessian Spring provides a home for salamanders and other stream creatures that have little, if any, appropriate habitat anywhere else in the borough. So yeah, we had crossed the stream. I mean, it's still coming down from the hill. It's very cool. And this little tidbit was awesome. The stone foundations of one of the British outposts along the ridge overlooking Richmond Creek can still be seen near the stream's source. So, for those who don't know, and I've talked about this before in my Conference House episode, which I will link down below, Staten Island during the Revolutionary War was very loyal to the king and Britain. So, you had the other boroughs, which weren't really even really boroughs. You had Manhattan, you had Brooklyn and Queens, which are still technically like Long Island. Uh, and they were all rebels. They were all Americans. They were colonials. They wanted freedom. And Staten Island was very loyal to the British. So Staten Island had lots of British soldiers, and there was a British um, troop outpost along the ridge here, overlooking Richmond Creek, so that you get that viewpoint, the vantage point, if you can see any of the rebels coming in. Uh, a little further down the road, the remains of a rock retaining wall constructed to hold back the hill above can be seen. We saw that on our hike. Careful examination of the hillside reveals an overgrown roadway angling up from Old Mill Road toward the golf course. Uh, so this article doesn't really talk too much about it, but taking a left turn at the point where the trails meet will lead you to Ketchum's Hill. This rise was known as Cemetery Hill in colonial times because the top of the hill was used for burials. So this is what we're talking about, the hill that Rebecca and I had found that is now a little turnaround for golf carts. For a time in the 60s and 70s, it was nicknamed Motorcycle Hill and was crisscrossed with dirt paths. Today, with some help from replanted trees, it has returned to a wooded habitat. And it has, for the most part. Um, but like I said, you kind of go up through this sort of not too dense, but it's overgrown. It's not a trail. You're kind of going through thorn bushes and weeds and all that good stuff. And then you kind of come to the top of the hill, and that's the golf course. But that's where the cemetery was supposed to be. Even before the arrival of the Dutch, the Lenape Native Americans used the island on a seasonal basis. Evidence of a large campsite in a clearing in the woods near Ketchum's Mill Pond was noted in the proceedings on the Natural Science Association of Staten Island in 1903, so 120 odd years ago. Grooved axes and early relics were found at the site, although no shells were associated with it. Shells might normally be expected considering the nearby salt marshes. So, yeah, the Native Americans would dig up a lot of the clams and oysters and just shellfish from the waters around Staten Island. And you can still see it. You go walking on the beach and there's just mussel shells and all sorts of shellfish, horseshoe crabs and clams and oysters and all that good stuff. So again, there's no ghost stories associated with this, but it was a cemetery. It's in the woods. People don't know it's there. It's not even marked as a cemetery anymore. I mean, luckily somebody had put it on Google Maps, but it's very sad to me. And looking at that other part from findagrave.com, it's just saying there used to be 23 gravestones still standing in 1901. No standing gravestones remain. And our question was, did they move the bodies or did they just take down the gravestones and build a golf course? So a little perturbing for us, a little upsetting for us because that's just the modern world sort of creeping in and disrespecting the dead. So we don't know. It's like in Poltergeist, you forgot to move the bodies. You didn't move the bodies. Um, there's no gravestones there. Like I said, it's a paved little turnaround for golf carts. So very sad. And it's a beautiful little hill and with a beautiful view. And people are buried there. And I'm guessing they're probably still there because back in the early 1900s, history wasn't so important. And I don't know if they moved the bodies. We couldn't find anywhere that said if they did or didn't. We looked. Maybe that information's out there, but you know how Google can be. If you don't Google the exact right thing or find the exact right article, you won't find it. But we have not been able to determine whether or not the bodies have been moved or just the gravestones or everything. But very sad that people were buried back there and are no longer there. All right, everybody. Thank you for watching this episode. This was pretty cool for me to do. Thanks to Rebecca for suggesting this because this is a little different than what I normally do. There's some ghost stories in here, but for the most part, this is more just spooky and a little morbid and a little creepy, especially like with things like Hart Island or Executioner Rocks Light. Um, just cool places that have this sort of disturbing history, dark human history that just surrounds death. And some of them have some ghost stories, some of them have some potential ghost stories, but I don't know. Uh, but yeah, so some untold stories of some New York City cemeteries and burial grounds that most people have never heard of, myself included. So this was a very cool episode for me. I learned a lot. And if you guys enjoyed this, let me know in the comments below. I can do more targeted episodes on certain cemeteries if you want. If you liked any of these stories, I can dig up more information and talk about that. Uh, but in the meantime, everybody, thank you all for watching. I appreciate all you guys. You guys have been great. All you fans, everybody who's commented or left feedback for us or reviews, really appreciate you guys. So until next time, everybody, question everything. Uh, that's what we have to do. And when it comes to the paranormal or cryptozoology or the unexplained or mysteries, question everything. Why did Eliza go missing? Why do apparitions show up in these photographs? Question everything. And until next time, everybody, rock and roll.